Only be live. Okay, cool. We're live. And welcome, everybody. We are talking about prefetching. This is very timely for a couple reasons. One is, we've spent like 3 times going on deep dives on what the right prefetching strategy for Quick is. There was the time that Mishka went super deep for our initial POCs. There's the time that I think Adam, after that, you went super deep on how should Quick City be and how should the defaults be. And now there's the latest iteration. And I can say from my point of view, I've just been on Slack, just watching updates. This works. This doesn't work. This is better. Da da da. We're measuring this. Da 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 da. There's been so much going on, and just so much little discussions I see on Twitter of like, Chrome recommends this, but it's not supported in Safari. And so then again, there's all these kind of back and forth on what is the right way. I'm sure it depends a bit on, prefetching the JavaScript versus like the next page or parts of the next page and this and that. And so without further ado, I shortly want to hand it over to Adam, who's doing the most research here. And like I mentioned, I am not fully caught up in the latest greatest. So this is going to be educational for me and hopefully others here on what is the right way, what are we learning, what are the open questions, stuff like that. Adam, you want to start by getting us a little caught up here on prefetching, the what, why, how?
Yeah, sure. I think that there's really kind of two topics of like, what do we prefetch, and then how do we do it? Kind of what we labeled as like the implementation of the prefetch, and then also the implementation or the prefetch strategy. And so that's been a lot of this research of just like, because we have, a build system that's able to be very fine-grained and we understand the different symbols of this page use this symbol, this page not use this symbol, or it's impossible to use this symbol. We kind of gather all that information. With that information, we can then know is like, it's not possible to even render this stuff, so let's not even try downloading that. So there's a lot of that work was done there of just like, we know for a fact that you might need, or it's possible to click this button. So let's prefetch that. But all these other things, not possible. So let's not even bother prefetching that. So that's the first step. And that's kind of been a lot of the fun part. And that's been a lot of like the most recent kind of updates that we're doing for prefetching the next page. But then the big question is like, okay, now that we know that bundle A, B, and C need to be prefetched, somehow we know that those need to be prefetched. What's the best way to do that? So it's easy to say like, oh, just go prefetch it. But like, there's 3 or 4 different ways to do that, and that's with link rel prefetch, rel preload, module preload, and even just relying on HTTP caching of just like, well, let's just kind of fetch it, and we know it's going to get cached in the browser. So the next time we fetch it, it should be immediate, So that's kind of the initial different ways to do it. And then there's also the way that we're kind of landed on, and I feel it's the best way is through service worker caching. So basically being able to have the service worker do all the heavy lifting instead. And what's also nice is that a service worker is actually a web worker, which means that it's happening into a different thread. But at the same time, where it's getting saved in the caches object is accessible from both sides, from both the main thread and the web worker thread. So that's the high level of kind of where we're at right now of like the different implementation strategies. And I kind of can stop there of like what questions we have of like kind of what stuff didn't work for us and why we kept moving on.
May I say something? I feel like this like not podcast, this live streaming is kind of like a long answer to this very common question that comes like every single time we talk about Quick, right? Like every single time we talk about resumability, every single time we talk about like progressiveness of how Quick kind of that stuff when you click is like, oh, but then it's going to download when the user clicks, and what if the interaction, and this is like totally false, right? Like that's not at all how Quick works in production, right? And I think it's super important that resumability and progressiveness is not about downloading when you click, right? And the other very interesting aspect is that all these prefetching things we will talk about is like built into Quick. Like it's something we just do for you. And I don't think other frameworks like kind of have this concept. I think they don't have it because they just download everything, right? So it's like you don't really need to solve this problem. And we have like go very deep, especially Adam is like extremely deep into how to solve this problem from all the perspectives. So
yeah, it's like lazy loading is great until it's not, right? Like everything should be lazy loaded, but if you lazy load, now all of a sudden you can have that slow delay. And that's where prefetching comes in. And again, like it's kind of two problems that we're solving of just like, how do you know what to prefetch? And then how do you prefetch it are the two different things that I think like we're doing a good job of. And like what I've seen with a lot of the other frameworks is that, yeah, so they know the Webpack build, then they have these 100 JavaScript files that are inside of some folder. Let's go prefetch those, right? And maybe they get a little bit smart, like, well, maybe let's prefetch half those or something like that. And so that's the common thing. So they somehow get that collection of just like whatever in that build directory, you're probably going to need that. And then the other side of it, it's like, let's use module preload because these are ESM modules. So like that's what you should use. Or let's use link rel prefetch. So they use one of those solutions. But as we found, and really Michiko kind of discovered this, and actually I think as a lot of community members discovered this, is just that link rel preload works great on desktop and on your Chrome browser during development. And so you can see like, oh, it's prefetch. This is great. It wasn't executed, but it was downloaded. This is amazing. But the reality is it works great in Chrome and Edge, and especially great on your desktop browser with fast internet connection and fast CPU. But in mobile, that's a different story. That's where we see that actually link rel preload isn't supported by Safari, which oddly enough, some people use iPhones out in the world. And that's really where you need it, is out in the world of, on a mobile device. And so I was kind of shocked to see, the more research I did, I saw that like actually link rel preload and module preload, they're not as widely supported as we like to think, even though that's kind of what everyone says that's what you should do. And so when it's not supported, then all of a sudden there goes the whole prefetching strategy. Like, again, during development, you're like, oh, this is amazing. It does exactly what it's supposed to do. It has a 1 millisecond response time on my local host machine, on my desktop M1, M2 MacBook Pro. But in the reality, and even Firefox, we saw that it doesn't support it. What was the scenario, Michiko, of when Firefox doesn't support?
For some reason, Firefox decided that when it's HTTPS, it doesn't support it. If it's HTTP, it's fine. Why exactly they decided that secure files are not okay, I don't know.
Yeah, so
actually
again,
had a setting for it. Yeah.
So again, like with Firefox, which is also widely used, to say that like, well, prefetching is great on Chrome and your development machine, but it's never going to work on Safari or Firefox. And so that's where we hit that. We're like, prefetching is like kind of a big benefit for us to do that with Quick. We need to come up with a different solution, and not kind of as even though they're defined in the standards. I think defining the standards versus actually being implemented is two different things. And both Firefox and Safari have it listed in their radar of we should implement this, but it's gone 5 years now without any comment other than people asking when they're going to implement this. So there's kind of been no signals. And so in this time frame, maybe maybe it's updated tomorrow. We don't know. But regardless, we went with a solution using service workers where we can be much, much more fine-grained of exactly what's happening, which is kind of cool because when you just spit out link rel preload elements inside of HTML, you still really don't have much control over that. You just kind of just like count on like, let's hope that it does the right thing. But with service worker caching and really just the caching, you're able to get the response and actually read the headers, read what's going on, what's inside of this. Should I cache this? What's the path name? So there's so much more that you can decide within the service worker of, oh, I've already prefetched this. Let's not bother ever again. Oh, this is immutable, never bother again. So there's so much more that you can do with that level of caching. And we're only intercepting just the build files that we are aware of. And that's where it's usually the traditional problem with the service worker caching is like, because it doesn't understand the build, it's like, well, let's intercept everything. And that's where the common issue with service workers is that once you intercept everything, like how do I know what to respond with a cache and how do I not know? And that's
mostly use this workbox, no? Like most of the implementations is to use this workbox library that I remember integrating with a stencil, and basically what it does is in build mode, it will just do like a red deer through the build directory, get all the files, and then just like download everything, right? Like that was how the service works. So you get online. So just also want to say that when we're talking about service worker, we are not talking about that. We are talking about something like very, very like into the build of Quick.
Yes.
Make this efficient.
Yeah.
I think what's similar.
I want to
go ahead.
jump in here. I apologize. I think we should make something clear. I think we kind of mentioned it, but I don't think it's clear enough, which is that usually when you have normal systems, you start with your source code, right? Then you have a framework, a meta framework or something like that. And eventually, as the last step, you have the bundling system, right? And then you push it into the production. The thing is, because bundling is the last step, the framework or the meta framework doesn't know about what kind of bundles you produced. And because it doesn't know what kind of bundles you produced, there's very little it can do in terms of prefetching or intelligent prefetching, right? Like you can list everything, but on the end of the day, the system just doesn't know about the bundles. The thing that's interesting in the quick city approach is that the bundle information is actually fed back into the framework. So the framework can reason about it and can produce these prefetching things based on correct order or the expected order of things, and can separate out things that clearly are not reachable and things that are reachable. And I just wanted to make this explicit that it is not something that it's kind of a different, innovative thing that is unique to this particular approach.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Whereas like what you're both saying is like the Webpack loader and things like that, they don't really know how the system was put together. I just know it's like, oh, I need to bundle these things together, and it's going to throw it into this directory. And then the service worker workbox is like, oh, I bet everything inside of here, let's just like pre-catch that. And so normally it makes this big array of all these files. The first time that service worker is installed, like, all right, let's go download the world. It might be 2 megabytes, but who cares? Let's go download everything because you might need it. And that's another difference, is that the traditional service worker is very static built. I would just like, it's built one time, download the world. And when there's an update, well, let's delete everything that we've already downloaded before, all the caches, let's get rid of all of them and let's download the world again. Like, and that's the common, any blog you read about is like, well, that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to delete all the cache.
Typical update, no? Update service worker thing.
Update
like,
service worker.
Here, and it will do like
delete everything and then download everything again. And that's really, that's the norm right now. And so that's another thing that we're doing differently. It's like, well, there's a good chance that most of those hashed files didn't actually change. So why are we deleting everything? And to just download everything again. So there's two different things are happening here. It's like, well, one, we're aware of all the bundle names. Like we know what valid ones are for this most recent build, but that doesn't mean we need to go download the world. And then also when there's an update, there's a good chance that that file that we've already downloaded is still valid. So we don't delete that one again too. So we kind of always have this shared cache. We don't delete like the main database and just reload it again. We just kind of just keep it clean.
Sorry, it's not just about the files. It's also about understanding the relationship between the files, right? The import graph ahead of time, which is, again, something that's hard to understand otherwise.
Yeah, and that's what's fun. So what we have today, and I think what's in the doc site today, is we know which files. Actually, the doc site is using the service worker, the most recent iteration. Like let's go to a home page, and there's a mobile menu that's in the right side that has an event listener for on click. And so when that page loads, we didn't prefetch the render, we didn't prefetch all the components, we didn't prefetch really anything other than to know like this listener is possible to click. And so that's the one thing that we prefetch. And then when you go to page 2, it's going to say, hey, we make sure that we prefetch this one on click listener. The service will be like, yeah, I already got that. So there's a lot of, again, like the service work is a little bit different, where it's not like this static file. It just was one install and that's it. Instead, we're constantly communicating with it through post messages of just like, hey, make sure you got this. Hey, make sure you got this. We're kind of just always sending information. It might have already received that information 100 times, but either way, the service worker is like, yep, we're good to go. Don't worry about it. We've already downloaded it. And then I think that's the big difference of what we're doing.
So is it fair to say that with your latest findings, like I want to also tie this back to sort of how this could be relatable to those watching, right? Everybody watching is probably not using Quick today, but you can benefit from our learnings in a way similar to what Ryan writes here. So he wrote this comment at the time we were talking about how preload, module preload doesn't actually work for a lot of devices out there, and doesn't have as far as I understand, a good fallback system, a good way to say like, oh, if you support this, use that, otherwise use this, or a good analog there. And he makes a good point here. The point I want to make sure is clear to those watching is we know these things well because this is a bit of an existential thing for Quick, because Quick does not depend on everything loaded up front. We can choose how and when we load things, which means the optimization of the framework and the user experience heavily comes down to being ridiculously smart about this. So we're in a position where the pressure point is on us to figure out the most optimal path. And I think others can benefit, right? Like, from my understanding, how like a Next.js or Gatsby or perhaps like a Svelte Kit or maybe Solid Start, they'll want to prefetch some subsequent pages you might view, right? Like if you go on the Gatsby docs, they're wicked fast to navigate because they pretty aggressively prefetch links that are in view. Now, I believe they do that from the main thread, and they're actually just, I could be wrong about this, but I know there's the whole split of like, if you statically generate JSON, you can fetch the next JSON, you can fetch the next JavaScript. And I believe the JSON happens on the main thread, and the JavaScript maybe is using one of these prefetch techniques. So anybody with any application probably has some things that load lazily. The whole application does not load either subsequent pages, subsequent data, or you might use some sort of import on interaction pattern, like this giant third-party library that only downloads if you click a certain button. And then I think just to tie back sort of what you're saying in terms of like kind of like takeaways people can take at them, are you essentially saying that what we found is the only way to do this right is just to handle it yourself, to create a service worker and say, I'm in charge of everything? Is that sort of where we've landed for Quick as the best approach?
I feel for Quick, it certainly has become the best approach. Now, when I say you need to do it yourself, this might be something that maybe Workbox needs to do, or other frameworks need to implement, because it is quite complicated. And I think service workers, it's pretty easy to screw up, and so that's why the service worker that we're providing is very fine grained of just like, these exact paths are the ones we know we want to intercept. The rest of them, I have no idea. You continue to do your thing, website, and so with what we have landed in Quick City is that you can still have your own service worker. It's just in your service worker, you would import Quick City's implementation and apply that. And then you can change the orders. Like, actually, I want my fetch to happen before yours. So it still allows a lot of customization, and there's still not like a one size fits all service worker. It's rather like, I want to implement these one features that are available through Quick City, but I also want to do my own things inside of the service worker. So that's entirely available too. But yeah, I think a lot of this came from when we were thinking about how Wiz works, where Wiz was really down. It works with like really traditional or old school JavaScript, where kind of it puts a lot of bundles on the window, right? But that was also to its benefit of just like saying like, oh, this is already downloaded, so I don't need to download it again. So like it does a lot of like pretty straightforward JavaScript there of just like, oh, it's on the bundle's downloaded, things like that. But when it comes to a dynamic import, which is what Quick really is leveraged on, like it's very hard to know like, how do I intercept this dynamic import and know that it's been downloaded? And that's where it's like, oh, how do I intercept this HTTP request? And like, oh, that's a service worker. That's what intercepts those things. And so that's kind of where it came down to. It's like we need to be able to get involved in module, like knowing if it's been downloaded or not. And so that's where service worker came in.
Feels like all the native prefetching APIs in the browsers are more like hints, right? So it's kind of fine if it doesn't do it, right? But for a resumable framework, you can't rely on hints, right? You need something more reliable that can do this in a reliable way, right? The same for Wits, the same for Quick. I can imagine for other resumable frameworks, they have to have a more reliable API. And unfortunately, there is not anything like that built in, right?
Yeah, and we have any framework would have the advantage of like what are your bundles, and we know that they're hashed. Like we know this is immutable, it's never going to change. So it is perfectly fine to cache that for forever, as long as we just keep that cache clean of just like on the next build, looks like this bundle isn't possible anymore, unless it's okay to delete it. And so there's a lot of that too, about that extra knowledge that then something like Workbox doesn't really have that framework knowledge of just like, is this a CSS file that's for something else, or is this my framework file that it's okay to cache? So that helps us out a lot.
Yeah, I think also I think connecting with this, what Steve said about how you can get some of these experiments or knowledge for other frameworks. I feel like for other frameworks, kind of the navigation is kind of the unit of prefetching, right? that's the unit of prefetching. So when you talk about prefetching, it's like I'm going to prefetch the next page or things like that, right? And in Quick, right, you don't download any JavaScript by default. So when we talk about prefetching, we also talk about that, but more especially like anything, right? Like this link handler or the rendering of this component. And I think also like a common question I just came out to my mind, but it's a good question. It's like if you have to download this code, it's not just the same, right? It's like a question. Like if you have, imagine you have a very complex application in both React and Quick, right? And you have to prefetch a lot in the Quick application, right? So you could even say, oh, there is very little benefit because in React we might pretty much download the same stuff eagerly. But the nice thing I think about prefetching and how in Quick works is that the order of prefetching and the priority of prefetching has a UX impact. So you may have a big application, but you can say, and you might have to download 200 kilobytes of things. Maybe you have super complex things, but you can say, look, this buy button that maybe people click there to buy, that needs to be the first thing. And then with Quick, that will work, right? Even if you still need to prefetch other stuff and the whole application to be fully interactive, right? Like to be fully interactive needs to download more. The nice thing about prefetching is that you can even prioritize these things, right? And I think that has a direct impact in the UX, and it also has a direct impact when you have low latency. I think like some of the critics with Quick is like, oh, how about the low latency, like a low latency, like a high latency network, really bad network. I will say that it's actually better because first of all, you might have to download less, and the less you download, you can prioritize it and say this piece of JavaScript, this handler, is super important. Do it first, and that will work before the rest of the things download. So I think that's also like very cool thing about prefetching when we apply it in this context.
Yeah, another thing that I found was kind of nice is like so in your case where it's on a slow network, and we start prefetching it, and then they click it. Something that we're also able to do is like we can like, well, this is already being downloaded. We've already kicked it off. We're already a second into it. And I see that you're requesting this. Well, we already got it going, right? Whereas with using like module preload and something like that, it's going to kick off a second request, so it kind of defeated the purpose of what we're doing. And I need to verify that on every browser, but that's what I've seen where it's like the browser doesn't know. It's like, am I supposed to share the same one? But in our case, the service worker is like, oh, I know for a fact that this is a mutable file and I've already started downloaded it a second ago. Let's just piggyback off that one. And so we kind of already kicked off the request you're about to click anyways, which is also gives us like back to that like fine grained control that you kind of don't have with the other prefetching strategies.
That's actually a really good point. That's a huge challenge with like CDNs too, is you don't know until the reply that this will be an immutable cached asset.
Right.
So you actually are forced to fire multiple requests and you just don't know. But in our case, we do know. Like one question I had for you, Adam, is are we using Workbox as part of our implementation, or we're going totally a little bit lower level directly
No, I mean,
all this?
And a lot of this knowledge comes from like Partytown, like how I got Partytown to work, stuff like that. But no, we're not. But it's very, very similar in the concept where, Workbox, you insert some import script of like its CDN stuff, and then some Webpack loader or rollup plugin, something like that, knows all the bundled files, puts it into this big array. And then Workbox knows like, well, let's start looping through all these and download the entire world because you might use it someday. So we don't do that, but we do have basically the manifest of like, these are the possible bundles. These are the symbols that exist, but we kind of just know it. Like it's just, a static file. It's there. And then as these pages load, or as you mouse over certain links, it's kind of sending the information to the web service worker of just like, hey, you might need this pretty soon. Why don't you see about downloading that? Or it's gonna be like, I already downloaded that, or it's already halfway being downloaded. We don't need to kick off another request. And so the main thread is really just kind of posting information to the service worker of like, might need this, right? It's really just hints. And then the service worker is kind of making the decision. It was like, yep, this is important. We're already downloading it. Or like, I don't have it yet. let's start download it now. And so like what's cool is on desktop, you have the mouse over effect, basically what you described with Gatsby. We're able to do that too. Is like on desktop, on mouse over, there's a good chance that they are going to mouse over it, but don't click it for another 150 milliseconds later. And so that already started downloading it, probably already downloaded it in that time. Depends. And then the other one is like, yeah, that's great. But like on a mobile device where you really need this stuff, mouse over doesn't work. And so that's where we also have the second trick where if your screen width is less than 800 pixels and the link is visible, then let's go prefetch that. And this would all be configurable. I mean, that's kind of what we have today. It certainly could be changed to whatever your certain numbers, metrics you want, or only do 2 at a time. I don't know. But I think it kind of solves the problem of like, as you're scrolling on mobile, which only has a, 460 some pixel width, it's only gonna be showing a handful of pixel or links at a time, versus on desktop, you could be downloading 100 links at a time. And so that's why we kind of have the 2 different strategies.
Go ahead, Manu.
No, I feel like this is like we are talking about like the links and the width, but I think it's also like configurable at any level. Like you can configure you don't want to prefetch for this particular link, or even the prefetching has an order. Like I'm still thinking about, I think like, do you know this guest library?
Just gonna bring that up. Guest, you're talking about Guest.js by Mingo, right?
You do all these things, right? When something happens, but on top of that, right, we are thinking about how we prioritize this, right? Because we know that for a hello world might be simple, you just have maybe 2 links to prefetch, but in an actual real application, you might have a lot of things. So we can leverage a lot of this, like, use real traffic information to know what things actually matter to prefetch. And maybe you realize that actually for that link, you really never have to, right? And it's things that can iteratively happen without even having to change the code, right? We can just, I imagine like in the front end, it's going to be even like front end engineers making the application at some point, like just focusing in the components on whatever the syntax is, and it's going to be like another team kind of like using the data to re-bundle and re-optimize things without even having to change the code. And I think now it's very complicated because it's all like kind of mixed, right? If you create a new boundary, you have to put a dynamic import, so you actually have to go to the code and change it. I think with Quick, the cool thing is that you just write it and then you completely delegate to a different layer of your engineering stack to say, okay, now we are going to do things differently, and feed this information into the service worker. And I think it's just like the opportunities are like crazy.
Yeah, I want to add to it, which is that the realization I had at some point is that at the time when you're writing software and when you're writing the code, the behavior, you really have no idea in terms of what an ideal bundling strategies or what an ideal preloading or prefetching or any of those things are. And so it is unfair at the time of writing the code for the developer to be responsible for this. Not only is it the developer doesn't have that information, developers focused on something completely different. And so you don't want to split their brain and, spend time thinking about something that's irrelevant. So it is very important that prefetching, preloading, and all of that stuff is really a configuration information that happens after the application is written.
Yeah, what's also I find. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Adam. You go.
I was gonna say what I find cool is that none of this requires a change to like the core of how Quick works. Like there's no Quick modules, right? There's no special way to load it. It's really just a dynamic import. But then Quick City is able to sprinkle on some ways to optimize this. That's also why we call it an optimizer, is that we're able to pull information of like, how is this put together, and then we've got this whole manifest of all how this is put together. Let's hand it to the next guy, and they're like, well, actually, I know how we could best prefetch things. I know how we could intercept it. So it's cool that this project really has nothing to do with modifying Quick. It's rather just like, we've already extracted information on Quick. How can we optimize the request and response for it?
Yeah, and so that's where I was just talking to Minko, created Guest.js this last weekend. He was describing how it works and how it can work for Quick too. Basically, yeah, you just have all your data in BigQuery or something, and you run a neural network model overnight on that, and then it can just basically decide for certain paths, here's the ideal ordering, and then exactly, supply that into the application, various ways that can be done, and then ta-da, you've got a smart ordering that's essentially automatic. And I think that's the funny thing. I mean, a lot of what we're talking about here is, so when I think about the term resumability, I think about that idea of the server to client handoff. But what's interesting is we're talking about a very similar, maybe the same concept in other ways, right? This idea of most caches operate on this idea of wipe everything and then rebuild it. It's like, well, it sounds a lot like what we're doing regarding resumability of the hydration process, right? We're very keen on just like everything being incremental. And I actually am even wondering here, we talked about the sort of HTML first nature of Quick, and then everybody responds with like, oh, well, what about, delays on interactivity? It's like, well, maybe there's sort of a different mental model we should be speaking to, just around everything being very kind of incremental. We talk about this idea of like Netflix style streaming of your video or streaming your application in an ever more intelligent way. And I find that interesting because there's one other part of the conversation we were talking about that applying as well. But I've got, here's one other quick one. And I just also want to butt in here. We could talk for hours about this, no doubt. But if anybody watching has questions, especially like, how does this apply to me? Like, what can I do to make my Next.js application faster, whatever, please throw it in and we can help sort of translate these learnings that occasionally might be esoteric, maybe to those specific use cases. But this is one very much for you, Adam. Did we find those issues we talked about with preload? Because Ryan's pointing out that, I think a lot of the frameworks are using preload currently for the JavaScript pieces of the subsequent pages.
Yeah, one issue I saw people make a mistake with preload is that you get a warning if you don't use it, right? Let's say let's preload these 5 files and turns out you only use 2 of them or something like that. You're going to get a warning like 3 seconds later of like, hey, you preloaded this. You didn't need to though, because we never used that file. And so that's kind of one issue. So it kind of comes down to is like, you need to know exactly which files you're going to run. And there might be an optimization, or probably is an optimization that like the preload knows how to download it and execute it, get it ready to go, versus prefetching is just going to download it but doesn't execute it. But in our case, we don't get involved of like the pre-execution of it at all. That's kind of where Quick comes in, where it does like, I've never downloaded this before. Let's do a brand new HTTP request. Downloads that file, puts it into the Quick framework, then makes it basically executable at that point. It's now cached within Quick. It's now within, I think we got a map of all the different QRLs that are loaded. So that's kind of cached at that point. So the second time Quick tries to get it, it's already loaded. So we kind of don't need to have that preload feature of that optimization of like, let's download it and make it executable, because we kind of handle that when we need to.
Great. To kind of jump in here, you're using the word pre-executing or something like that. I think pre-parsing is what you want. It is. Okay. I just want to make it clear to people is that no code is actually being executed, right? So I am concerned when you say pre-execute.
Yes, you're correct.
What's happening is that you use a preload. You tell the parser in the browser to pre-parse the AST so that if you execute it, you're faster because you haven't skipped the parsing part. In our particular case, you have all of these possible ways that the user can interact with the application. It is not clear whether pre-parsing everything is actually useful, because that's actually keeping the browser busy, and chances are pretty good that as a user of the website, you will not interact with vast majority of the code that's there, right? And so pre-parsing all of it is actually would be detrimental, which kind of reminds me is like, it would really be nice if browsers had API for loading JavaScript and telling the browser like, go pre-parse this thing, because I think there's a pretty good chance, like if you hover over a link, like that's a very strong signal that you'll probably click on it. Whereas if the link is visible, probably just fetch it, but don't bother parsing it. And it would be nice to be able to actually make that nuance with it. But I don't believe that currently we have any sort of API to kind of tell the browser to do these kinds of tricks.
No, yeah, for the most part, we just rely in a good way of like never pre-parsing anything. We just download the request and it kind of just stays as a string in the cache. And then the moment that Quick does need it, that's the person that opens it up and then parses and executes it. But then it's kind of cached within Quick, that it's not an issue for any additional times there.
You know what would be fascinating if we could figure out how to get the data on this? I would love to get the data on how many event listeners are on the average page and how many clicks an average person does per page. Because I bet you the average clicks is close to 1 and the average amount of event listeners is massive. So you're downloading like 100 times more stuff per page than what a user actually cares. Each page, like, largely are just clicking to some new thing. Do you want to say something on that, Mishko?
Yeah, this should be trivial, especially in an Angular application because of Zone.js. Like Zone.js knows about all the listeners everywhere. So that should be a relatively straightforward way of getting that information.
Oh yeah, maybe we could use Puppeteer to load up the top 50 something sites and just, yeah, we won't know their traffic and behavioral patterns, but we can know bits and pieces. We could look at maybe some stuff we have access to of our website. I bet you we just looked at our website, which is a pretty normal website. It's probably 1 click per page, but we can find that out. We can circle back on that. It's funny too, because, maybe the best way of describing this, it's so funny, like a traditional Jamstack, say like a React app, is a lot like, going back to the Netflix metaphor, it's a lot like downloading your entire video before you can play it. And the quick approach is much like buffering, right? You're just buffering pieces sort of as you need it. And obviously being smart. I guess the big difference, the big technical challenge is that there's not a linear path. There's a, huge explosion of different paths. But that's where, like Adam said, being very smart about sort of hovers or visibility helps a ton. Hints or things that can be determined at bundle time. Maybe hints that the developer can add, like add to cart, is critical. And then the idea of analytics and machine learning is a really interesting one as well. Monty, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, I recall something that Mishko said in some talk about, how we talk about quick as this zero JavaScript, right? And when we talk about that, it's like initially, right? Like you can have interactivity without all this initial JavaScript. But then I think, Mishko, you said something like, this is all about getting better at delivering JavaScript, right? So it's like, which means, like, of course it means like download less. And, I think like most of the JavaScript downloaded is pure overhead. It's a JavaScript that doesn't do anything for the application. It's like, it's kind of ridiculous, right? You are downloading 100 kilobytes to show a console log, right? When you click, that's the kind of level we are talking about. Like all the JavaScript is doing nothing, right? And Quick solves that problem with resumability, but this is just one of the problems, right? Then it's like the prefetching is also part of this delivering JavaScript efficiently, right? And I think it really fits into the whole problem, right? Like we're just realizing this, like it's not about the zero JavaScript, it's about how to extremely efficiently deliver this JavaScript.
If you look at a typical application, I think you're going to realize that most of the code that you have written for the application executes exactly once an application boot up and then never again. Like a lot of code in your application is really there for just the initial kind of setup, and then it's never needed again. And so what we're trying to do with resumability is like, hey, let's not pay the price for that. Let's not waste time downloading it and executing it, etc., because it's a one-time thing. And people can argue about like, well, how much of the code is kind of in this category? And I'm going to argue that it's actually quite a lot, because if you think about it, browser jitters do the same exact thing, right? They only optimize or JIT code that is run repeatedly. All other code that isn't run repeatedly is just interpreted. And we don't even notice because like, well, it's only run once at the beginning, whatever, right? So skipping all of this stuff is kind of important. And the fact that browsers take advantage for jitter to me is like a justification. Like there's a lot of this, like it's a lot more than you think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think an aha moment I had with Quick was like, why are we rendering HTML elements and applying attributes and properties to add an event listener? Like if you think about that, it's like, yeah, everyone does. Like React, you need to render this whole component to add a click listener. It's like, but isn't that just a function being added to an element? Why did I need to render code? And the act of rendering then pulls in the rest of the world to make that work. And so, yeah, I think that's where Quick is really different and kind of hard to describe. Is like, there's actually you can question of like, why are we even rendering anything for just event listeners? And that's what a big difference of what Quick's able to do is skip that entire process because it's entirely unnecessary.
I will say that they have to do it because the click listener may actually use some state, right? Like you could come up with a very simple case where your event listener just does a console log, and they will say that yeah, they easily can be done. But the moment this event listener needs to do set value in some reactivity of the framework, that's when it's like now you actually need to run it, right? That's kind of I mean that's kind of the learning that we also have, like, but that's where the complexity relies. And
That's what I find super hilarious about this. I mean, I'm not sure if there's any exceptions to this. You all tell me if so. I mean, basically all performance optimization, or at least those that we spend our time looking at, is just all about doing less work, right? And what's funny is when you have these conversations about, oh, we can skip this step, a frequent reply is, well, that step doesn't cost that much. And if you look at everything that way, we have some funny Twitter threads on this. And it's like, yeah, but you don't realize the stuff adds up. And this is a lot of like what Ryan did with Solid.js, right? Is like, do we really have to loop through so much just to update DOM node? Can you just change a variable and the DOM node he used the term before, laser. Can we just laser into that DOM node and make the change? And it's fascinating. And can we just remove hydration? Can we remove rebuilding of caches? Like, how much work can we stop redoing or overdoing just to do what seems like a trivial task, but maintaining that DX of components that we like? Okay, everybody wants to talk now, so I'll shut up.
I just want to say is like, this is what I always say, which is like, you can't beat not doing something, right? Like you can optimize the heck out of a particular algorithm or whatever, and you can like get excited just how amazing fast it is, and then somebody comes along and is like, yeah, I just don't do that, right? And like the game's over. Like there's nothing like you can never make the algorithm zero. Like zero is zero. Like you're done.
Fastest database call is the one you didn't make. Yeah. No, this reminds me of I completely lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, what basically Manu and I were debating this morning of so just like what you described with the Gatsby link, when you mouse over, we want to preload like, oh, you're going to need these things. But a lot of what we're working on right now is like, well, how do I know exactly what you're going to need for the next page? Because you might already have the layout page, you might already have had rendered most of the left menu. If the next page thinks I need the left menu and the layout page, why should I download that again if I don't actually re-render it? And so again, like all of our work goes into like, how do we know what not to do? And so luckily within the DOM, we do know all of these keys that are being applied at the moment. And so along with this messaging system to the service worker, we can say, look, these are all the keys that are in the DOM right now. And so when the service is like, oh, if you've got the layout already working, you've already got the left menu working, that means that you don't need to download this file at all. And there's a good chance you're never going to ever download this. And so that's where the prefetching gets even more fine-grained of just like, you already have these stuff downloaded, or you not even downloaded. You already have these things working. It's already in the DOM. There's no point to download a JavaScript to re-render. Let's just get the few things that you might need in this path.
I think the big realization when we were talking about this is how we were you always think about prefetching like, I'm going to this page. So the amount of things to prefetch is a function of where you are going, right? Like I'm going here. So that function will give me what to prefetch, but actually it's a function of where I am and where I'm going, right? And when you have a very deep understanding of these two things, like I'm here, I'm going here, and this is the current state, you can get even like further and be like, I'm really prefetching exactly what it needs, right? But it's complicated, right? It's like when we talked before, like you need to have this knowledge, like you have to have very strong semantics to do these things.
I'm going to be a broken record. I'm going to be a broken record, and I'm going to say you can only do that if you have the knowledge of the bundle graph, right? And most systems do not.
But
right?
not only that, right? Like if you use Webpack, you have that knowledge. The bundling graph.
You need to have the knowledge at the right location, right? Webpack has the knowledge, but Webpack cannot influence prefetching or runtime, or Webpack certainly doesn't have the knowledge of where the user is right now, because that's a dynamic information. And Webpack is only about static information, right? Or Webpack doesn't have information about where the user is going, right? So Webpack has the information of the graph, but it doesn't have the starting and ending information, and it has no way of influencing the generated HTML.
I will just say that this is the semantics. Like they have the information, but it doesn't have any meaning. Like you have a graph of things, and you don't know it. You don't know what the things are, right? And I think it's more about like here we kind of have the same graph, but we have the very strong semantics about this is this. This can happen when you click in here, and all that things, right? That's I kind of annotated. It's like a
we have the information at the right location with the right information to do the right thing, right? And
there's another piece too. Plus, Quick can render out of order, right? So you don't have to render entire trees at a time. You can render just small pieces, which obviously is a critical thing. But I want to not miss the chance to pull in this question that's incredibly relevant to what we were talking about maybe a minute ago, which is, I've been dying to ask this too. So when we talk about prefetching, I mean, there's really three common things to prefetch. I'm going to ignore assets like images and videos for a second. Say the framework itself is usually going to probably prefetch HTML, like maybe a full or part of a next page to HTML. That's a little more rare today, but something we've explored with Quick and a possibility with resumability. There's prefetching JavaScript, which I think we've spent a lot of our time talking about just now. And then there's prefetching data, right? So something that you'll have, let's go back to like Gatsby docs, because someone just the other day was talking about how snappy it is, and it is really snappy. And I think part of that is a lot of times when you're browsing through docs, you're actually browsing through the same exact component tree with different data. So you're just prefetching next JSON and re-rendering with just that. There's no additional JavaScript in many cases. So Adam, I'm curious, are we doing anything on these sort of prefetching of the JSON data, the resources, stuff like that as well? Or if not, kind of what do we have in mind? Anyway, anything on the top?
So specifically about like going to the next page and getting JSON data about that page, yes. And so QuickCity has that, and that's what's on running the doc site right now, is that there's at the same path, there's going to be q-data.json is the actual, and that kind of has all the information about that page. So it's twofold. It's one, it gives us all the information about like what it's going to need, but also it's going to have like the client side data, so like a product data or something like that. So it kind of does like the endpoint data, and so this is useful for both SSR and SSG. The doc site uses SSG, static site generation, to do that. But yeah, with this Q data JSON object, JSON information, that's kind of the big hint of just like I moused over this. We then quickly go get that file. That file's like, oh, you're going to need all these things downloaded. And we know that the state of your current application already has these things being applied to the DOM. So you actually only need to download this one thing, which is going to be what the re-render is. And so then when that page loads, it's like, oh, and actually you might be able to click this one thing. So let's prefetch these two things. So that's kind of a lot of, high level what it's doing. So yes, we do have all that JSON data about each page, and we gather this, at build time, especially or at like when it's being rendered. So like during SSG, it's going to render that index HTML file. Through that process, we gathered all the information about what's possible, and so then we save basically that same data as the JSON data and how we're doing it.
So does this? Go ahead.
I was going to add. I think this idea of prefetching JSON, it stems from kind of the existing mental model of replayable applications which have hydration, which the application wakes up and it's like, oh, I need data. Where do I get it? Right?
All of it, yeah.
Yeah. Whereas in Quick World, right, data is already serialized. So when your application resumes, it's like, well, I already have data. Why exactly would you want to fetch anything? Like presumably, whatever data you need was already inline serialized, etc. at the server. So the only kind of scenarios I could imagine is like when you wake up and you're like, okay, well now I need to go and get a stream of stock quotes because they continuously change or something of that sort, right? But in the normal scenarios, I think the need for prefetching JSON is a lot less than in a kind of a classical way of approaching the problem.
This is more for navigating to subsequent pages, I think. That's like the Gatsby rule or the Next.js. Like this is one maybe we can circle back on, or maybe I can ask quickly because you might have a quick answer, Adam. Like Next.js will make a distinction between a page with a get server-side props method and a page with a get static props method. So get static props, you're kind of declaring that this is a static page. These things are very cacheable assets or resources. On the get server side props, those things might be more unique to the visitor and more expensive. So you'd want to prefetch the next page. If you're rendering client side, you need that JSON to generate it new. Of course, we can have ways of pre-generating HTML too. But if you want to go to the next page, do we distinguish like, oh, this next page is a static page we can pull the static JSON. It's not necessarily expensive, but maybe if you're navigating alternatively to like your user settings page, where you may not want to query your user settings from the database unless you're actually going to arrive onto that page, or you actually have. Let me know if I'm making sense, and I'm curious if this is something we're addressing.
I should probably point out that like one big difference or one advantage to Quick is that the whole SPA, single page application versus multiple page application, MPA, that argument is a lot less even need to be brought up, because you can easily do both with the identical code. You can hit refresh and it's going to work just fine, load all the data you want, it's going to be serialized inside the HTML. But then if you choose to use an SPA link, use the link component that Quick City provides, then it can do a client-side navigation to the next page. And using that method is where it would download like, well, I need to get the data for this page, and I need to go to product 2 now. And so that's where like, well, where does product 2 come from if I'm just client-side JavaScript? That's where it would get it from the Q data JSON file. Is like, that's kind of where it comes from, which is, an SSG that's going to be pre-generated. In SSR, it will get it from the server. But in the end, it's identical of how that works. If that helps answer the question, I don't know if I went on a different tangent.
I understood something different though. I understand. Maybe he should clarify the question. I think it's interesting because what I think he is referring is that you need to render a component, and this component has an on mount, and in on mount he does some fetch or something unrelated to Quick City. Like some work. So you can start doing it before. And I don't know, I think if you use Quick City, you will definitely get all these benefits. From the perspective of Quick, I think that we have this API called use resource, right? And use resource right now is very simple. You can track some data and it returns something, right? And it's pretty basic in that sense. But we already, or at least I already been thinking how we can even like annotate some of what a use resource does. So for example, a use resource right now gives you information, but we already talk about how we could have like some sort of caching information about the resource itself. So saying what this resource is returning is static, right? So you can even like do optimizations. I think like if we apply the same, we can even have like a use resource, which will be this API you will use to do some fetch on the component, could be annotated with some like prefetch information. So that will later be used for Quick and Quick City. I can imagine we can do all these kind of things. And I feel we can do it because we have like a strong API with a strong semantic about this API is about loading data. So
yeah,
we can, and I think like in other frameworks, just like use effect. And inside the use effect, you use fetch. Then it's very hard to understand the application, right? What is going on. But with use resource, I feel we have a very, very good semantic to build these features if requested.
Yeah, and Quick City has is built on top of a thing called an HTTP server, right? Where it's just has on get, on post requests, so like it's very like how servers work. And so the on get response, the data that comes from that is the same thing, and that's the exact same identical data that's inside of the Q data JSON object. That's where I got it from. And so because we control like the on get, on post, and be able to intercept those and get the data from those things, like it really makes it a lot easier to then have all that server-side logic inside of your posts of kind of what you want to do. Another thing that Steve, you were talking about like the get server-side props and things like that. So Quick also does that. Quick City also does that with the static site generation, what I'm calling the on static generate, because that's what it is. It's during this site generation, let's do something. And so that's really useful for the dynamic routes. And so like the About Us page, that's a static route. You don't need to have a dynamic, it's static. The About Us, load that. But let's say you had 1,000 products and each of those products have different URLs. That's what the get static pages, get static routes. Something like that is what Next.js
get static paths. Yeah.
Get static paths. Yes, that's what it is. So that's what on static generate does. It's the same thing. It's like for those dynamic pages, when we need to know what 1,000 pages to render, it's going to go to like, oh, let's go to my pages route, and that's going to have a dynamic params. That's where it's like, yeah, but what data do I put in these params? That's where this response with like get all this information, and then like let server side or static site generation blow through all those 1,000 products and render those pages. But again, that's like having that control of that router makes it a lot easier for us to then also know how to prefetch for that route, which is also kind of some things that we're doing is like, we know this route uses these layouts, which uses these symbols, which is already being applied. You don't need to download it. So there's lots of that stuff too. It's like being able to tie the router to the symbols.
So we actually have a question I'll come back to on that one, but I don't want to forget a question from AJ here in the chat. And so I believe I know the answer, but people might be able to tell me otherwise. So we were talking about sort of prefetching versus pre-parsing, or populating a cache versus actually parsing to the AST or the information the VM needs to execute a little bit faster the JavaScript. I will say I have never observed a noticeable delay because of the need to pre-parse. I have seen it ironically in HTML. A very large piece of HTML actually having a noticeable cost on parsing time. Less with JavaScript, maybe because of what Mishka was saying, the jitter being so smart and incremental. A lot of time obviously has gone into that. And for those who don't know, when we're saying jitter, we're talking about just-in-time optimizations by the runtime, by the compiler. Mishka, let me know if I butchered any of that. It's what our modern VMs are quite good at, just kind of running and optimizing JavaScript on the fly. Doesn't need to see and pre-compile everything in one go. But yeah, and I think I'll just throw up the second half of this is sort of the note about like, well, there's got to be lots of brief gaps where we could be doing this pre-parsing. But to my knowledge, anybody correct me if I'm wrong, there just is no way to do that, right? I mean, you could instantiate a new function that you're not supposed to do, pass a string to that and say, okay, I've created my function instance in memory. That would negate the dynamic imports that we're using, the just ECMAScript's dynamic imports, which makes things so elegant. I'm not sure if the browser uses a smart caching mechanism where if the same string is, instantiated in a new function and then it sees an import, which includes, pulls JavaScript and that string is identical, would say, oh, I've made an AST of this. Does anybody know the answer to this? I'm inclined to say I don't know of any option, but unless anybody knows of one that exists.
I have no idea the low level of how. I would imagine that they have optimized this quite heavily, but I have no idea of like what it actually does. But it just reminds me of like what the difference between the link rel prefetch and preload is. Whereas like if you use preload, and it's going to download and parse, but then you don't ever actually use that JavaScript, that's where Chrome is like, hey, why did you bother downloading and pre-parsing this if you never end up using it? So I think it might be the kind of the same problem here is like, if we do download a bunch of code and then we say, let's start, pre-parsing this in case you use it, which might end up being, who's to say it's not a megabyte of code you pre-parse unnecessarily for every single page you go to. And so I think that like, if we got into that, it's kind of the same issue of like preloads, like, stop making me do all this work if you're never going to use it. So I think it might be kind of the same problem.
I just like a thing I remember. There was actually a proposal to have some sort of EST version of JavaScript. So that will be actually smaller, like WebAssembly, but JavaScript. And I remember like this was like not like there was no way this was going to be shipped. I was reading the comments and basically every browser have different ASTs, right? So they will be like a very different way, very hard to things. And then they also like another proposal was not to ship the AST but the bytecode like Java, right? Which it will be even more efficient, but that was like even worse. Like there is no way. Like every engine is completely different. So just remember that one. Maybe a bit unrelated with the conversation, but I don't think they will be really up to.
It's definitely interesting. Yeah, I think I should have pointed out too, when I was saying new function, I meant like the function constructor that you can pass a string. But even then, yeah, it depends on if the browser's doing a smart caching. It's keeping a map of things, strings of JavaScript that's parsed before. I don't know. We'd have to test it. I will just say, I think like all things, we kind of wait to see what's creating a material bottleneck, and then we start chasing that down and finding things. This hasn't been a material bottleneck that we've observed currently. But if it becomes one, I think we can chase some things down, and it raises that. Go ahead, Adam.
And one other note is that because we are so fine-grained, we create very small bundles to begin with. So we never really have a big Webpack 1 megabyte file that has parsing issues. I'm sure it's somewhere measurable, but it's not really a bottleneck for us.
Yeah, I think like what's important is that when parsing happens, it can be in parallel, right? So when we already have prefetch, right, and then turns out that you have a file and this file has like 5 static imports, right? As the browser can find these dynamic imports, even before finishing the file, it will start already like loading the other files and do the parsing in parallel. Which there's like at some point I ran this like a profiler, but not the one you can get in the DevTools, but the one other deep, the V8 profiler, where you could see this kind of thing, like the internal work, and it can do it all in parallel. So I think the biggest win is downloading it, right? And then when it actually happens, even if it's a lot of files, very small, actually small files is better because it all can happen in parallel. It's the best setup.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So you all tell me if I'm summarizing this correctly. I think the general summary is there's 1,000 ways to prefetch anything. And unless you're using a service worker and controlling it deeply, a little bit of wild, wild west, right? So prefetching is not a critical thing for you. Sure, throw up some link prefetch tags, use a strategy that makes sense to you. It may or may not do what you expect. But if it's not essential to your application, it's kind of like, why not find a happy balance? But actually, if you want to have extremely fine-grained control and be able to ensure that you're doing the most optimal thing, implement your own service worker with all the challenges and pains that comes with that. So maybe the easiest answer for anybody who's like, just give me something out of a box, Quick City is our approach. If you think what we made sense here, if you think what we said here made sense, it's all being built into Quick City as we speak. And if you want to do things your own, obviously share with us your findings. We love collaborating with people like Ryan, who's constantly doing research here on Solid.js and Solid Start. Tweet at us, Discord at us. It's really interesting research. And as Ryan pointed out, we're at a bit of the forefront of some of it because it's so important to the Quick framework to do this well, more so than others. So with that said, I appreciate everybody coming in, asking questions, hearing us ramble about prefetching. We think it's fun and exciting. And we have a beta release of Quick coming very soon. I won't spoil the date for anybody, but we do have a date set, and we also won't share it just in case we miss the date. But it's coming very, very soon, and we'll have a lot of this good stuff baked in, and we'll probably have a lot of line items, plans of what we want to do next. So
one thing I learned from Angular days is never ever share a date.
Yeah. Internally, not externally. Yeah, exactly. So we'll have a surprise beta announcement, but it's not too far off. And for anybody who wants to use Quick today, to be honest, what's the difference between the Quick today and Quick in beta? Only difference is it'll say beta. So if you're saying, oh, I can't use it till it's in beta, you could start using it. But yeah, we'll make it more official very, very soon. And everything's always, like we said, we like to do everything incrementally. We're incrementally making the docs better, the developer experience better. And we're already doing a lot of the work to lock down APIs. So the API service should not need to change as we make things better, causing you to have to refactor anything. So with all that said, thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, Builder Crew, for coming in and speaking, and we will catch you all next time. Actually, just to tease, we have Pete next time, right, Mishko?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, cool. Tentatively, we got to confirm, but next week we should be talking about using. Oh, I don't want to butcher this. Mishko, tell us the topic in your words.
I actually don't know what the topic is. I know Pete is here from Vercel, and I think he's going to be talking about Cloudflare, and he's talking about edge workers and basically the idea of micro front ends, but on the edge worker side. In other words, could I have multiple edge workers collaborate to produce a single HTML application, right? And could each edge worker be a separate team that's owned by a separate team, and a team can separately deploy, rollback, and maintain it, because otherwise applications get so huge that it's hard to have everybody on the same page, right?
Yeah, it's a really cool demo he made where it shows the power of quick containers, the resumability approach, and using multiple edge workers, to make micro deployments of part of your application. And it has some really interesting implications on personalization too. So we're really, with a lot of these topics, talking about speed and scale, right? We're not talking about issues for your hello worlds, my mini blog that has 3 pages. We're talking about you have a pretty serious thing with a lot of people working on it. It needs to be fast, reliable, personalized, etc. So that'll be a cool one. Edge workers, quick personalization, micro front ends, resumability. We'll come up with a nice name. Catch us same time, same place. We missed last week, but we shouldn't be doing misses in the future. So thank you, everybody. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks.